Hello, I hope you're doing well. I got a really good question recently, so I thought we'd talk about it and answer it today. It's a very simple question, but it has a very wide scope, and I think it's a great one to talk about. The question is essentially, can you recommend 3 books I should read? There's no specification of genre, tropes they want to read, any particular ideas they want to explore. It's just 3 books I'd recommend someone to read without knowing anything about them. This is kind of a tall order. I do have books that I recommend just generally. People ask. I have books that I give to people on birthdays, holidays. If I don't know them that well, I will often just buy them. One of the few books that I like to buy for people as gifts. Depending on the person, if I know a little bit about them, that could be The Alchemist, that could be Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it could be The Hobbit, it could be Slaughterhouse-Five. But this question got me thinking in a different direction. If someone only has time to read a few books, 3 books in this example, I want to give them books that are going to be impactful. That if they are actually interested in reading, that if they're not getting started in a specific genre, if they're not getting started with reading in general, what 3 books would I recommend that had an impact on me, that I found wonderful to read, exciting, interesting, challenging, whatever it is that drew me to them and kept them in my head? What 3 books are that impactful that if you only had time for 3, they'd be worth reading? So here in front of me, out of view of the camera, I have those 3 books, and we're going to discuss them one at a time. First, if you know me, this is no shock. If you've seen more of my videos, this is no shock. It's Dune. Dune by Frank Herbert is without a doubt my favorite book of all time. There are editions that are much smaller than this. This makes it look kind of intimidating, but it is intimidating in the sense that the world building is complex and deep. It's basically a whole world of its own. If you think about the intricacies of our life on this planet and in the universe in general, this book is sort of its own parallel universe. It has enough complexity that it feels remarkably real. I have a significantly longer video on this book specifically, which I'll link in the description of this video. But to give you a brief backdrop on what it is and why I'd recommend it specifically in this context, that's kind of the big deal here. Dune is the story of Paul Atreides, who is sort of what could be seen as a prince in his version of society. Humans live on a variety of planets. There's a lot of political maneuvering that goes on between great houses that control different planets. Paul is a member of House Atreides. It's a house that has gained some power over the years. They have rivals in House Harkonnen. House Harkonnen controls a planet called Arrakis, aka Dune. And the setup for the book, which is not a spoiler, it's just the exposition, is House Atreides is given control of Dune instead of House Harkonnen. This sets up one of the most interesting personal stories on Paul's level, but also larger political and religious stories that happens as a result of Paul's intervention, as a result of just these forces of humanity and politics and massive wealth all sort of converging on this one planet. It is critical to note that Paul is not necessarily the hero. When you read this, if you do read it, keep that in mind. This book has deep themes about religion, religious fervor. It has themes about climate change. It has a lot of themes about humanity, what it means to be human, what empathy is, time, destiny, so many different things that this book contains. It is, in my opinion, a facsimile of life. You can experience everything Paul does, and it actually feels as though he's living. And that is one of the reasons I think this book is so critical if I were to give 3 recommendations and only 3. This is one of the best examples in literature of extraordinary characterization and dynamic character growth. Beyond that, the themes of course hit hard and they are relevant to the modern day. In some ways they're very significant to the survival and continued success of our species. But just on a personal level, this book is the science fiction book in my opinion. This inspired Star Wars, this inspired Star Trek, this inspired pretty much everything since it was published. And it wasn't wholly original. It pulled a lot of different inspirations from different cultures, different stories that already existed. But it clarified them and brought them together in a way that was entirely new and super significant for the genre and literature in general. There's a reason it's been adapted multiple times in films. The films are huge. It's just big and it's significant. And I think it's so incredibly worth reading if you're down to just get into it and get into the world building. A story that actually feels real, where you can explore ideas and new things and bring them back into your own life. This is all of those things and more. It does have sequels, but this works perfectly well as a standalone. I think it might even work better as a standalone, in my personal opinion, for Paul's story. But this, again, if it's just 3, this absolutely has to be there. This video is actually just shaping up to be my top 3 books of all time because we're jumping right into Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This book competed for a long time with Dune for that #1 spot in my all-time reading favorites list. Dune edged Frankenstein out ever so slightly because the world building is insane and I love world building. But Frankenstein is just as good of a book, if not better in some ways. And it's even more significant in the canon of literature and in the canon of science fiction that Dune is. This is the first modern science fiction book. There is argument over what was the first piece of science fiction literature ever. This has one of the strongest cases, even over some old stories. Because like some people argue that Gilgamesh, which is the oldest myth story that we have, is science fiction. So it's like, do you immediately have science fiction upon the the genesis of stories and literature. I don't know where I stand on that debate, honestly, but I do advocate for Frankenstein as the first modern science fiction book. So many people only know Frankenstein as the Halloween generic monster that is some sort of zombie brought back to life by a mad scientist. That is kind of part of the story, but it's so much more than that. My introduction to this book was when I was in college. I was an English major for one semester. I went back to biology after that, but I loved that semester. During that semester, I read this in 2 different classes, so I read it twice. One class was science fiction literature, and the other class was an intro to writing class, but specifically focused on literature about the Arctic. I didn't realize it was about the Arctic when I signed up. That was something I found out the first day, and I was like, okay, we're just gonna roll with this. This book actually does take place partially in the Arctic, which is quite interesting. The book itself is so much more than just the genesis of this monster. Monster is in air quotes for reasons you'll understand if you read the book, but Frankenstein is the doctor who made the dude, not the dude who was reanimated. This book is about the monster essentially figuring out what it means to be human. He has this creator that, this is not really a spoiler, it's exposition, sort of casts him off into the world without much preparation, without love, without care. He has to figure out what it means to be a person, to explore empathy, to explore pain and loss and loneliness and sorrow. The book explores the idea of what it means to actually be a monster. It's so much about what it means to be an other, to be different from the mean of society, different from the average. It criticizes the way that in society we so often see people who are different and say that they're monstrous, that they're something bad because of their difference, when in fact the truly monstrous act is to be the one judging someone for their difference that they often can't control. That idea of otherness, the manifestation of a monster, is so strong in this book, and I love that theme in other books. I love that theme in films. I love that theme throughout fiction. It reflects so strongly in the world that we exist in, especially these days with all the divisiveness going on. It really drives home the point that so much pain comes from a lack of empathy and an overabundance of judgment. I guess I've been analyzing the book for a few minutes now, but at the end of the day, this is just an extraordinary read. It's well written, it's beautifully written, actually. Mary Shelley wrote this, I think, as a teenager, so the fact that she did that at that age is absolutely incredible, especially in a time where women weren't really considered writers, especially in science fiction. She was incredible. I'm a huge fan of her courage and obviously her talent. But this book, to me, is a treatise on what it means to be human. All the good, all the bad, every single shade of gray is right here. On to our final book. I don't know if this is my number 3 book of all time. It's in my top 10 for sure. I love this so much. I actually have 2 copies. It's The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. First of all, this cover is so cool. Let me get that to focus. It's so sick. That's the old one. This is one of the newer ones. I quite like it as well. This book is extraordinary for so many reasons. It's well known as a treatise on gender and the role of gender in society because the whole thing is about a human who has one specific kind of reproductive organ, one set of hormonal expression in his body. This human goes to a planet of humans that have different gender expression and different physiological manifestations of gender that actually don't manifest except for a specific time in their reproductive cycle. So these humans, the vast majority of the time, are non-binary. That does not stop the main character, who's physiologically male, from gendering them as male at most times, from commenting on their perceived femininity. There is deep exploration of the way that gender fluidity impacts their society. So of course the commentary on sexuality, on gender is extraordinary, and the commentary on judgment, the commentary on gender roles in society, the expectations we place on ourselves and others, the damages therein, that is all here. But more than anything, this is a story about connection. I don't want to spoil anything. I'm not going to go into too much depth about what exactly happens. But you have this very alien society, at least from the perspective of the main character. The vast majority of this book is actually about his attempts to understand and interact and interface with these people. His overall goal is actually to bring them into the fold of a larger human society that spans planets. But that, in my opinion, is like a story vector to increase the characterization of him and everyone else and really focus in on the way that his need to understand them, his need to interface with them, impacts his perception of them and their world, and their judgment of him for being different. He interacts with a variety of different characters, all from this planet, all that are non-binary most of the time, some that become feminine, some that become masculine. Sometimes things are adversarial, but the real magic of this book, I think, happens when understanding occurs. And a lot like Frankenstein, this book is about judgment, and it's about humanity, what it means to be human, what it means to look past the things that we think are different about other people, about ourselves, and actually just work to connect to people on the level of like, you're a person, I'm a person, What is there to be mad about? It's really beautiful, and I think it makes the point that if we could all just understand ourselves on that level and stop judging for these arbitrary things, we would be able to achieve something on the scale of a multi-planetary human coalition. Like, that's kind of cool. There are some very weird things in this book. There actually is just one that I struggle with. Content warning for themes of intimacy. Incest is a thing in this book. That's the only thing that really made me uncomfortable. I don't really understand that too. I actually looked it up because I was like, what did I miss about that being thematically significant? And the author, Ursula Le Guin, was kind of just like, I don't know, man, you tell me. So I really don't know. If any of you know what that was about, tell me. It's no worse than Game of Thrones. It's actually handled with way more moral weight. Don't let that put you off completely from reading this. It's kind of a small part of it. It is justly condemned, and people who engage in it are like ostracized in a certain way in the society. It is actually a plot element. It's important for one character's development and growth and where they are in the story. Personally, if I needed to do that to a character and I were writing this, I would have handled it differently, but I'm not Ursula Le Guin, and she's a legend. So just gonna let her have that one, whatever she intended to have the meaning be. I don't get it. Maybe someone who is better at literary analysis than I am does get it and can explain to me why it's significant. But this book really isn't about that. It's about the connection between people who are very different. It's well written, it's very entertaining, it is visually striking. And it's something that comes up in my daily life when I have an interaction with someone who has an idea or opinion or viewpoint that's vastly different from my own. That is what I got out of this, and I think that's so valuable, again, especially in the modern world. So if you only have time to read 3 books, you want to read something impactful, significant, that I would recommend personally: Dune, Frankenstein, and The Left Hand of Darkness. Let me know your thoughts on these 3 books if you've read them. If you haven't read them and you're interested in reading them, let me know as well. I'm also going to pose the question to you to leave in the comments. What are 3 books you'd recommend, regardless of genre, regardless of themes, to anyone who only has time to read 3 books? What are your 3 essentials? Thank you so much for being here today, and happy reading.